news. Next on DW.
Priceless treasures stolen from war zones. Plundered and looted for the international art market. Collectors covet these extremely valuable and unique pieces from the Middle East, which fetch top prices at European auction houses. An immoral business that fills the coffers of terrorist factions. Blood treasures.
In 45 minutes on DW.
People in trucks injured while trying to flee the city center.
More and more refugees are being turned away at the border.
Families fleeing bomb attacks in Syria.
Police crackdown in Venezuela against demonstrators.
People fleeing extreme drought.
A raft carrying 200 people has sunk in the Aegean Sea.
Around the world, more than 300 million people are seeking refuge. We ask why? Because no one should have to flee. Make up your own mind. DW, made for minds.
This is DW News broadcasting from Berlin. In this special program, we take one step back and ask, why did Vladimir Putin invade Ukraine? He claimed it was to denazify and demilitarize the country. But is that the real reason? And what do the answers reveal about Putin's Russia? And what about President Putin himself? Joe Biden believes he wants to re-establish the former Soviet Union. Does the US president have a point?
The collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the century, a tragedy for all Russians.
I'm Birish Banerjee. Welcome to this special program on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In the next half hour, we'll look at the real motivations behind Vladimir Putin's attack on a sovereign nation and how the events of the Cold War inform the Russian president's worldview. But first, a look at Ukraine and its citizens, an independent people facing a war forced onto them.
Disbelief echoes through Ukraine's cities. An ugly war that is destroying homes and hopes.
I never thought that this could happen. I never thought this would truly happen in my lifetime. We wrote poems about the Second World War. I myself am a teacher. We studied the history. But we never thought that it would happen here.
Olyena Kurylo has lived in this apartment block in the city of Tuguyev in eastern Ukraine. It has become uninhabitable. In the capital, Kyiv, bombs hit this residential area. While she was sleeping, Oksana Gulyenko was thrown 3 meters from her bed to the corridor.
I was completely confused. I didn't understand what was happening to me. It was as if I was lifted up and dropped. Then I heard screams, sounds. I got up and saw all the windows smashed, broken glass. I quickly gathered a few things, documents I had prepared, and I ran out into the street.
That's been the story for many. Those who can have rushed to leave the city. The result, thousands of Kyiv residents stuck in traffic. Especially children are traumatized. One Kyiv resident who had fled with his family describes their experience.
It was a hard moment, I would say, because you always have this dilemma what to tell to your kids. On one hand, you don't want to scare them, but on the other hand, you don't want to lie to them. And we decided to tell them the truth. And we tell that the war started and that we are in danger. And that's why we need to go to our grannies, because it's a safe place now.
But in Ukraine, hardly any place seems safe. In Kyiv, people have been seeking protection in metro stations, school basements and bomb shelters.
I guess this is a bomb shelter that is close to my house. So, let's see. Here, sitting in the shelter, in the bomb shelter, and checking the news constantly. We were told that something might happen around 5 p.m. So we're just waiting.
Others gathered in an improvised shelter in a hotel. Alyona Tsakchenko is a cook here, but going up to work is not an option.
It's hard, but I'm holding on. Have you slept today? We were sleeping, but an explosion woke us up at 4:20 a.m. near our house. A missile was shot down.
What happens next, no one knows. But it seems certain that many more Ukrainians will suffer before the fighting stops.
And DW News teams are on the ground reporting on the fighting. Correspondent Fani Fachar was in Kyiv and sent us this report on what people in Ukraine's capital city are experiencing.
You do see the fear in people's eyes, regardless whether they say that they stay put and they want to resist with or without arms. But that fear basically results in different reactions. Some people left or trying to leave Ukraine. There are long queues that are forming both on the highways towards the west, long queues forming at gasoline stations. People were packing up on food and basic things at the few supermarkets that were still open here in Kyiv. So there are people who are really panicking and they want to leave. But then there are others who are concerned as well, but they say they're not going to take the sovereignty, the freedom, the democracy of the country away. In fact, I've just seen a few hours ago a young man on his bicycle carrying a Ukrainian flag. He was the only man here, the only person here at Maidan, at Independence Square. And it really was a picture to me that, yes, there's concern, there's fear, but there's also a sense or a mood of basically not having Russia to say what the future of this country is.
And 8 years back in 2014, exactly on the square where Fani was reporting from, the people of Ukraine decided they didn't want to be part of Russia's fold. Their choice reflected in their protests on that very square.
Chaos, death and revolution on Kyiv's Maidan Square in 2014. Protesters who want closer ties with Europe stand against pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych. His forces killed more than 100, but then he fled to Russia. The Kremlin called it a coup. Soon, soldiers in unmarked uniforms, so-called little green men, appeared in Ukraine's Crimea. A Crimean referendum on whether to leave Ukraine and join Russia was rejected as illegal by the international community. But it was followed swiftly by Russian annexation of Crimea in March 2014. By early summer that year, an insurgency against Ukrainian rule had broken out in the eastern Donbass region. While the Ukrainian army and Russian-backed separatists fought in Donbass, a civilian jet was shot down. Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 had nearly 300 people on board. Investigations said it had been hit by a Russian missile. By autumn 2014, the front lines had stabilised, despite continued shooting. The UN estimates that more than 13,000 people have been killed. Efforts to resolve the conflict politically via the Minsk process failed to make much headway. Years of uneasy deadlock were broken in spring 2021 when Russia sent military hardware and tens of thousands of troops to Ukraine's borders. By late April, there was relief in Kyiv as the Kremlin said it would recall its soldiers and that Russian President Vladimir Putin would meet US President Joe Biden. But some analysts say much of the military hardware and many troops actually stayed. That summer, Putin backed his military ideas with a long essay. He claimed Ukrainians and Russians were one people and said Ukraine could only be sovereign in partnership with Russia. But Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy refused to make concessions during the peace process over Donbass. And in November, Moscow sent tens of thousands of troops back to Ukraine's borders and into neighbouring Belarus. This time they were accompanied by enough hardware for a sustained campaign.
And that campaign has led to the destruction and death we are witnessing now. To help us make sense of the Russian attack, I'm joined in the studio by DW's chief international editor, Richard Walker, and from Vilnius in Lithuania by DW Russia analyst Konstantin Egat. Richard, to you first. I think the question on everybody's mind is, why did President Putin invade Ukraine?
Yeah, well, Birish, we're going to go deep into the background, of course, in our talks today, and it's great to be on with Konstantin today to talk about this as well. But I think the most immediate reason is that Vladimir Putin has decided to do what he can to dial back the clock to before the protests that we saw at the end of 2013, beginning of 2014 there, which toppled a government that was favourable towards Russia in Ukraine. He wants to dial back the clock to before then. He doesn't like the political direction that Ukraine has taken in recent years. He doesn't like the strategic direction it's taken. He doesn't like the social direction it's taken. So he has decided to remove the government and replace it with one that's more in the previous mould, one that he finds more pliant to his view of what Ukraine should be.
And that is a view that we will be discussing as we go along. Richard will stay with us in the studio, and Konstantin, I'd request you to stay on the line as well, because we do need to talk about President Putin, who is really central to understanding the reasons behind this war. Now, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz earlier in the week called this invasion Putin's war, a spy turned president. Here is a quick look at what drives him and shapes his convictions.
This is how Vladimir Putin likes to portray himself: strong, loyal to his country, and adventurous. A daredevil who doesn't shy away from danger. At the start of his career, it was a different story. Back then, he was considered a blank slate. As an intelligence officer, he spent years in Dresden in the former East Germany. After the fall of the Iron Curtain, shortly before the end of the Soviet Union, he returned to his homeland and became a confidant of Russian President Boris Yeltsin, who groomed him as his successor. Putin first became prime minister, then in May 2000 he was inaugurated as president. His goal was for Russia to once again become a global power. The collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the century, a tragedy for all Russians. Putin calls his way of governing guided democracy. He has brought much of the Russian media under Kremlin control and disempowered oligarchs who had grown rich under the chaotic years of Yeltsin's reign. Putin's decisive action in Chechnya also brought him widespread support. There, he waged an uncompromising war against Islamist rebels, a war in which many civilians were also killed. In terms of foreign policy, Putin initially had a good relationship with his Western counterparts.
I looked the man in the eye. I found him to be very straightforward and trustworthy.
But Putin has always viewed NATO's expansion after 1997 with suspicion. When the pro-Russian government in Ukraine fell in the autumn of 2013, Putin intervened. Separatists took control of eastern Ukraine, and Russian soldiers occupied the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea. Then Russia annexed it.
После
After a difficult, lengthy, tiring journey, Crimea and Sevastopol are returning to the home harbor. Putin was excluded from the G8, and the US and the EU imposed strong economic sanctions against Russia. But Putin has stuck to his course, governing in an increasingly authoritarian manner. He has quashed protests against his policies. Russian opposition members live in fear. Mikhail Khodorkovsky was inundated with trials, then forced into exile. Boris Nemtsov was murdered in the street. Alexei Navalny was poisoned, then saved by German doctors. The Kremlin actively supports anti-democratic movements across Europe. Russian hackers attempt to influence elections. In Russia, Putin is regarded by many as the eternal president. He's been re-elected 4 times, and in 2020, he changed the constitution, allowing him to stay in power even longer. Vladimir Putin took over his country at a difficult time, but he's led it with a firm hand, something analysts don't see changing anytime soon.
And we're back now with our Russian affairs analyst Konstantin Eggert in Vilnius, and in studio DW Chief International Editor Richard Walker. Konstantin, I'd like to go to you first. Now, a lot has been written about President Putin and his time as a KGB spy during the Cold War. In your view, how much does that shape him and President Putin's worldview?
Well, good morning. Not so good morning, frankly speaking. I think that the first essential thing is not to describe him as a spy. He was never a spy. The KGB was a huge political police organization in which only one directorate, the first chief directorate, was actually occupied with spying. Putin never served in it. He actually seemingly aspired to go there. But he was sent to East Germany, the GDR, as an officer for a different directorate, under the cover of director of the Russian Cultural, or rather at that time, of course, Soviet Cultural Center in Dresden, in East Germany. And it seems that his occupation was to watch the internal East German opposition and to probably monitor the activity of the Soviet personnel that was stationed there. There was, I would like to remind you, it was 1 million strong Soviet army contingent stationed in East Germany. Right. So I suppose that the KGB as such, of course, influenced him. It was the time when he thought he's going to make a fantastic career, because being a KGB officer was extremely prestigious in the Soviet Union, gave you a lot of perks, but additionally huge power. People would fear you if you were a KGB agent. KGB officer. So I think that this impacted him hugely. And his desire, if you wish, to have this power, unsaid power, intimidating power, is very much part of the, I think, KGB thinking. Another thing that's important, and full disclosure, I served 3 years as translator for the Soviet military mission in the Middle East. I was doing just my national army service, but of course in the course of my job I've seen quite a few people from the KGB. Right. And what actually characterized them is A, belief in conspiracy theories, and secondly, this understanding that the Soviet Union doesn't work, but it doesn't work because people do not have enough sausage. You put the sausage back in the shops, allow for some private enterprise, and you can run it wonderfully. And I think that this cynical view of human nature is actually another important thing to understand.
I'd like to go back to the point that you made about power, and I'd like to tie that in with what President Putin has said in the past. He has said, and we just played that report as well, he has said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a tragedy for all Russians. So what you're saying is that this is not so much about Russian pride, but personal power for President Putin?
Well, definitely. And actually, he used an even stronger term. He called the collapse of the Soviet Union the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. I think that it's true that he is, look, the thing is that a KGB officer was always brought up on the saying of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the Cheka Lenin's feared secret police, that the KGB officers, the security service officers, are the knights in shining armor of the revolution. And that breeds this understanding of, on the one hand, you belonging to a very elite organization, on the other hand, you fulfilling the national destiny. So for Putin, that conflates into one thing. It is essentially, yes, him, because he is defending a noble cause. And it is pretty much indistinguishable, personal power and convictions.
Right. Konstantin, stay on the line. I'd like to turn to you, Richard, just based on what Konstantin was saying and going back to the earlier point that you were making about he wants Ukraine to be, in a sense, subservient to him and to go back to the time before 2014 when it was, let's just say, within the Russian fold. It was at least pro-Russian in many ways. How do you see the current situation in light of that and the fact that for President Putin personally, power and national pride conflate into one?
Yeah, well, it's been really interesting to watch what Vladimir Putin has been saying during the course of this week as well. So if we remember, it's been a week absolutely dense with events, of course. But at the beginning of the week, he made this extraordinary address to the nation at the time where he announced that in the sort of first intensification of the crisis this week, that he was recognizing these breakaway regions of eastern Ukraine as independent states. The speech that he gave was really, and it would be fascinating to hear some of Konstantin's take on it as well. It was an hour-long, 7,500 words in the English translation. And it took this historical sweep in an effort to justify what he was about to do, and now in retrospect, what he's done later in the week as well with this invasion. And he completely delegitimized the idea that Ukraine is a sovereign state at all, instead regarding it as something that is an appendage of the Russian Empire, essentially. And going way back even before the Soviet Union and accusing Soviet leaders such as Lenin and Stalin even of making mistakes with regard to Ukraine. So taking an even kind of grander long sweep view of Russian history and giving this strong impression that he feels after 20-plus years in power, and perhaps with another decade and a half in power, but certainly beginning to think about his legacy as a Russian leader, that he wants to undo some of what he sees as the mistakes of the past and essentially reunite what he sees essentially as part of the Russian Empire and not as a sovereign independent state.
Let's just take this to Konstantin. Konstantin, you were hearing Richard talk there. He talked about this historical sweep that President Putin referred to in his televised address. Can you give us some context on this? What prompts a Russian leader to think that Ukraine, which is recognized as a sovereign nation, does not essentially hold sovereignty and needs to bend to Russian will?
Well, for that, you need probably to live side by side with President Putin to understand what prompted this amazing turn in which basically now it's for the whole world to see that there's only one issue with which Putin is, well, frankly speaking, obsessed, and this is Ukraine. To put it in a wider context, judging by this speech to which Richard alluded, 7,000+ words, plus the piece he wrote for the Kremlin website, 5,000 words, plus a video explainer. Well, judging by them, it seems that he sees essentially getting back Ukraine as a way of righting the wrong of the unjust collapse of the Soviet Union and unjust treatment of the Soviet and then Russian states by the West. This is a way of saying we are still strong, we have our own sphere of influence, but I think I'm terribly sorry. I think it goes further. Judging by by the text analysis by quite a few Russian experts and actually people dealing in philology and history, Putin's been impacted by and very strongly, by the ideas of an obscure Russian philosopher, Ivan Ilyin. He was a white emigre philosopher after the Bolsheviks won the civil war in Russia in early 20th century. So some people say that if the Bolsheviks lost, he would have been the philosophical founder of kind of Russian corporatist state a la Mussolini. This idea that Russia needs one strong leader, no matter what is the name, emperor, president, governor, whatever, and that Russia can only survive if it keeps the three Slavic nations together, Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians.
Right.
This is a very, very strong sort of thread that goes through the writings of this man, Ilyin. And it seems that Putin took him on board. He quoted him several times in his speeches before. And I suppose that this is an attempt to write one's own page in history in golden letters, Putin thought, but now this is written in blood of the Ukrainians.
Unfortunately, that does appear to be the case. Konstantin, thanks so much for that. Richard, quick final word from you. Joe Biden said that President Putin attempts to be going back to the days of the Soviet Union. Is that the case?
Well, I think as we've just been hearing there, you could even say that he's attempting to go back even further. And I think with what Western leaders are really worried about at the moment, and it links in with what Konstantin was saying there about the single powerful leader, is that at this moment in his period in power, Vladimir Putin is totally uncontested. He's been in office for over 20 years. We saw during the course of this week these extraordinary displays of the subservience of even his closest team around him in the Kremlin, where he was belittling the head of his foreign intelligence service on live television. There's no one in Russia in a position of power, it appears, to act as any kind of check on his behaviour.
Right.
And as we're seeing in Ukraine, he's willing to go into very serious risks. So concerns about how far this sort of untrammeled power that he has, what it could lead to.
Richard, we'll have to end it there. Thanks so much for joining us in the studio. Konstantin, thank you so much for being with us. That's the end of this program, but coverage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues on DW News. You can always check out our website for the latest or our Facebook and Twitter pages. That's it. Goodbye.